And can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, we are good.
Okay, and if you want to just mute your microphone for one brief second, I'm going to introduce you and then I will let you have the stage. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this session. My name is Autumn Perry, and I'm the College Access and Success Program Director for both the Higher Education Policy Commission and the Community and Technical College System. If you do have any questions as we proceed through this session, just feel free to go ahead and pop those in the chat over to the right-hand side of the screen. And when we reach the end of the session, we will address those at that time. With that, I have the pleasure of introducing this session titled Addressing Equity in Our Schools, and our presenter for this session is Drew McClanahan. Drew is the Director of Leadership Support in the Office of Support and Accountability at the West Virginia Department of Education. Drew?
Thank you very much, Autumn. It's a pleasure to be here today. I do want to say that this is work that we're going to continue to provide throughout the state. And some of you may be familiar. In February, the West Virginia Board of Education, West Virginia Department of Education, in conjunction with the Herbert Henderson Office of Minority Affairs, actually announced the statewide public education equity agreement, where we set some parameters on the ability of all students, or the belief of the ability of all students to learn. And so the work that we're doing with this is certainly exciting. You might have heard some hot topics in the media recently, and we're certainly not going to discuss any hot topics. But I hope that you find the presentation useful today. And at the end, if any questions come up, feel free, and I will do whatever I can. At this point, I would like to share my presentation. And I think this should be good. Okay, so as the title of the presentation was, we're going to discuss today equity, addressing equity in our schools. And so we would like to take a quick look at the challenge, look at some data sources, talk about some research, and consider next steps. So we do want to spend a few moments understanding the challenge of equity that's set forth in front of us, and then talk about some specifics of maybe how to address the challenge at the school level. I do also want to apologize. I guess they decided above me or below me to start doing some construction today. And so if you hear some drilling or pounding, it is the construction that's going on. And so first, equity may be a term, hopefully, that most of you or all of you are familiar with. And as we begin to discuss the challenge ahead of looking at providing an equitable environment in our schools, I think it's important that we understand equity. And it's interesting because if you go, including this session, if you go to any number of sessions, conferences or presenters or speakers, you're going to hear a different definition, or even see different visuals. The one on the left that's presented here, we have equality, of what is provided equally across the board for all, as you can see, is not necessarily equitable as far as what that individual needs. Compared to the right. And then you can see the picture on the right with the apple tree, and making sure this one even takes it a step further of looking at how justice may be involved in this. I provide these pictures not only as a way to try to simplify the understanding, but just to show that there are going to be a number of ways that this topic is presented and explained. I believe that no matter where we see or who's presenting, the general principle is that individuals receive what they need to be successful. And I think that it's imperative, as we look at the standards, West Virginia standards for effective schools, and look at language and even research about student success, that we do hold true that all students can succeed and be successful, especially when given the appropriate parameters and safeguards that they need. And so I do think that it's important to keep in mind that no matter the picture or the iteration of the picture or definition that may be shown with equity, it is founded on the principle that we believe that all students can achieve and that we are providing for what all students may need. I was reading a book recently by a speaker, Principal Kafele. If some of you may be familiar with Principal Kafele, if not, I would encourage you to certainly follow him on social media. He's very active and very well versed in equity and school leadership. And he talked extensively about the role of humanity as far as equity, and really kind of defined equity as far as the humanity of teaching. And so as we move forward, we understand that there are going to be different definitions, and we understand the general principle behind equity. We do want to start to take a look at some primary challenges that may be that may show themselves as we begin to try to focus on equity inside of our schools or inside of our personal beliefs, and making sure that we are being equitable as educators, or making sure that our classroom climate or our schools have an equitable atmosphere and appropriate practices. It's important to look at some challenges and to understand that we do have challenges that are going to present themselves. We're all familiar with achievement gaps. I think it's a little interesting whenever we start to look at opportunity and excellence gaps. For instance, do we have students that are able to enroll in AP classes, let's say at the high school level, or dual credit classes at the high school level that maybe historically have not had the GPA or the grades that are needed or wanted in some of those classes, but maybe that's because they are disconnected or sometimes bored with school, bored with their classes. So I think that as we begin to look at these gaps, it's important to, I'm sorry, my phone is going off here. It's important to understand that these gaps are going to look different. We can look at attendance gaps, we can look at discipline gaps, but where we may see the evidence of these gaps is also going to be a very important piece of this. As we begin to look at data sets, do we have a process to evaluate root causes of where the data are? Do we have a process to really analyze the data that is presented both at a school level, at a district level, kind of large picture satellite data, if you will, or down to street level or map level data? Do we have the processes to try to look at the explanation as far as why these gaps exist? So I do want to go over a few examples of some of these data sets that maybe we look at. Again, trying to set the table as far as the challenge ahead of us. We know that we've historically seen achievement gaps in standardized test scores around the state. We know that we've seen attendance gaps from districts or from schools that low SES students have a more difficult time getting to school and not being chronically absent compared to students who maybe aren't low SES or come from two-parent homes with a higher income level or college background. We can certainly look at opportunity gaps with scheduling, but I want to take a look at some discipline numbers that we've used as examples for this work over the last year. And so as we look, the chart in front of you actually looks at suspension of students from 2014 to 2019. Obviously, the numbers last year as a whole were not necessarily the same, but the or even 2 years ago, whenever COVID first started, but the percentages, the percentages were very similar from that 2019-2020 year. But as we can see right now, this is the relationship of students on the basis of race, looking at discipline issues and incidents for compared to each other. So as we can see historically from 2014 to 2019, Black students inside of the state of West Virginia were referred at a much higher rate for discipline issues or incidents than their peers. Moving on, when we look at out-of-school suspensions, we can see students with out-of-school suspensions. This compares students by race with a disability or without a disability. So we can see that compared to white students with a disability, Black students with a disability, even compared to multiracial, Hispanic, Latino, or other students are suspended at a much higher rate. We can see that Hispanic or Latino students are suspended at a higher rate. We can see that multiracial students are suspended at a higher rate. And moreover, we can see that students with a disability are across the board suspended at a higher rate than students without a disability. As we talk about equity, I think it's important to look not only at numbers such as this across the board as far as whole group, but begin to layer it out and see what happens whenever we pack a layer of a subgroup onto our data. It's important for us at the end to get to the root cause analysis to try to ask the important questions as to why our data may look the way that they do. Similar data here looks at low SES students to non-low SES students. And as we can see, we certainly have groups throughout the state that are referred for discipline referrals, suspended for at a higher rate than their peers as we begin to layer on different levels or different subgroups. So as we think about being equitable, it's important for us not only to look at just the discipline data that we presented here, but think back to the achievement data, think to our attendance data or any other data sets that we may want to take a look at. So as we begin to want to think about what our data are telling us, let's think for just a few moments about what data sets are available to you. We just gave some examples of the discipline, and those are primarily going to be school level or even district level data. But as we really want to take a look at our schools, I think it's important for us to understand that we have different levels and different types of data. And so for us to think about different types of data, we may have student achievement data. We may have demographic data that informs where we are, how we're performing. We may have perceptual data. The perceptual data, I think, is really interesting when we dive into this work. That let's take attendance, for example. Students aren't coming to school, and we can see they're not coming to school maybe in this class or this period or at this grade level or in this part of the community from our district. But how often do we take a step back and ask parents or ask students why they're not coming to school? Why are we getting their perceptions as far as what may be impacting their decision to come to school or not? In addition to that, when we think about types of data, there was some research and work that we were doing with some peers recently, and a book was provided that leveled the data as satellite. So, your really large GSA scores, your SAT scores, map level data that may be getting into kind of school level, whole school level, and then even street level data, which kind of narrows it down to an even finer focus of looking at the particular student level data that we have. So I think it's important to understand that we do have these different data sets. And when we talk about equity, it's not just a gut feeling or how we feel, but we really have the data sets and the data types that are readily available for us to see. Now, where we can find some of those data sets, Zoom WVE is an excellent source. If we're looking for our early warning system, we can dive into some really great student level data trends from as early as kindergarten and first grade, looking at the predictive analytics as far as if they're predicted to graduate or not. If that's something that you or your district would want some training on, feel free to reach out to my office. Zoom WVE is an awesome source to look at our achievement scores, our attendance rates over the last 15 days, over the last 30 days. And we're going to find, kind of satellite and map level data or school and district level data there. We do have student grades, getting down to that kind of street level or student level grade. Or student level data. Are we looking at our student grades and understanding, are they turning in assignments? Are they not turning in assignments? I would be willing to bet that if we have any school classroom teachers or school level administrators here, that predominantly the reason why when we see students fail is because of missing assignments throughout their class. So do we have an understanding as far as where those assignments are missing, why the students aren't turning those assignments in? Are we looking at how one piece of data may inform another? Terrence Scott is a professor at University of Louisville and has done some really interesting work about student discipline and student engagement, and has been able to show through his research that the number one indicator for a student's discipline record is going to be classroom engagement and the quality of instruction that is provided to that student. So when we begin to look at things like student grades, are we actually comparing that across levels to really see what that student needs, or are we simply looking at it in a vacuum? So when we begin to think about, these can be very difficult. And moving on next, we're going to talk about, what we do at the school level. But I think it's important that we have processes in place, things like PLCs, leadership teams, LSICs. We even have some schools around the state that are wanting to start an equity team that would take a look at these data practices, that would take a look continuously at our discipline data, at our attendance data, at our achievement data, and monitor that on a consistent basis, because we do know what gets monitored gets done. And so kind of moving forward, we are going to talk about what we can do at the school level. And I do want to leave time at the end. I know we have an hour, but I would certainly like an open discussion for some questions here. And as we have all adapted to virtual processes, I certainly want to give time to answer some questions. But I want us to think about, as we move forward, if we think about, looking at data consistently, understanding where it's coming from, what are we going to do at the school level? And it's, I think, always important to go back to the standards. And as a part of the West Virginia Standards for Effective Schools, we do have a standard that's equitable opportunities to learn and effective instruction. And I want us to take just a few moments and really think about the language that is used through our standards, as each of these words certainly is put there very, very purposefully. And so instructional time utilized efficiently and effectively is something that I think that we can all, take a look at, and we will look moving forward about ensuring that we are utilizing the time appropriately inside of our classrooms, and that our activities inside the class are rigorous, aligned to student interest and state standards. We always hear the alignment to state standards, that we have to align, we have to teach the standards, stick specifically on the standards. But how we go about that with our specific curriculum, I think is a huge part of the equity conversation. That are we offering classes in our school that students are interested in, things that students want to take, things that students see the benefit in? Are we explaining the reason why we are teaching it in the particular way that we're teaching it? Are we changing our instructional practice to meet the need of the student, or are we simply just asking the students to come and meet us? And so with that, there are a few people that we and that I have tried to stay on board with. I mentioned Principal Kafele earlier, and this was an excerpt from one of his books where he talks about, the idea of teacher, do you know me? And he talks extensively about the duty and responsibility that we have to not only educate, not only teach science, let's say, but to teach science to students, not to teach math, but math to students. And I love the question, do we understand the totality of our students? Do we understand, the experiences relative to who they are when they leave the building? And if we think about where our students are, not only when they're with us from 7 to 3 or 8 to 4, but who are they when they leave the building? What do they do when they get home? What motivates them? How do they respond? How many of our students are going home and having to work jobs to help pay bills when they go home? How many of our students are going home and having to take care of a younger brother or sister, having to cook dinner for a family, not having a parent come home, not having a relative that truly cares and nurtures them? So we think about that experience when they go home. It certainly impacts who they are when they come to our building. And our buildings need to be places that not only understand, but really work to meet those students where they are. Do we understand their reality? And I think that question is really interesting to me when we start to talk about equity, because the whole idea of equity is not to, again, provide just an even playing field across the board, but it's to provide for what that student needs to be successful. And if we think about, what your reality may be and what my reality may be coming from different perceptions or different perspectives certainly will have an impact on who we are and how we respond to situations, how our students behave in class, how behavior is exhibited in class, whether or not we have homework that is done. We know all too well now that if we send a student home with homework and they have 8 different classes and an hour's worth of homework each night, but they have to also maybe go to a job so they can provide to pay rent or take care of a younger brother or sister, then that homework may be not at the top of their priorities for the evening. So thinking about their challenges, their goals, and their aspirations. How about how they learn? We look at how students interact with each other, and I think the conversation that's come up over the last year is very interesting. And there's a lot of very interesting debate right now about the term learning loss over the last year. And we're continuing to learn. We're always continuing to learn. But how? What knowledge are our students seeking out on their own time that's going to potentially motivate them when they come back into the school? So again, what motivates and inspires them? In addition to Principal Kafele, Pedro Noguero is a professor at the University of UCLA. He's at UCLA, and if you ever have a chance to see him, I suggest that you take the time to read or see. He is extremely well versed in the topic of equity and discusses some typical barriers that schools or teachers may see or districts may see whenever we begin to take a look at equity. And the first being complacency. And I think that it's very easy as we go in and talk about, our office also does a lot of work with school culture. And we can really define school culture with simply how we do things around here. So if you think about your organizations or your school culture, think about complacency of those individuals that may just simply say, we can't do that because this is the way that we do things around here, or we're okay with that. How often do we get our state standardized assessment score and simply say, well, our scores are at 20%, but that's not our fault. It may be the fault of this, or it may be the fault of that. That idea of it's not our fault would be a relationship to this idea of complacency. And it may not be your fault, quote unquote, but it is our responsibility to take a look at how we can move forward and how we can address those needs of the students. So it's the idea of, are we looking at this as an opportunity to meet the challenges that are set forth in front of us, or are we looking at it as a burden? And complacency will certainly allow that burden mindset to sneak in. Implicit bias and lower expectations are things that Dr. Noguero talks a lot about. And I think when we start to talk about low expectations, we can see that, again, it goes hand in hand a lot of times with complacency. Are we just expecting to get what we've always got without really making a lot of changes or taking a look at how we can change to better meet the individual needs of the students? And that's a tough hill to climb for a lot of organizations. Teaching and learning, the tendency to see teaching and learning is disconnected. This one's real interesting when you hear Dr. Noguero speak, and I think is something that we can think a lot about on how we address equity inside of our classes. Do we take a look at teaching and learning as directly connected? Do we ensure that they are directly connected? How many times we say, well, they should know that because we taught it. I've taught it. I've told them 100 times. I taught that 2 lessons ago, and they still haven't gotten it. Well, we may have taught it, but do they get it? Are our assessments, are our processes in our classrooms truly measuring student learning, or are they measuring participation? Are they measuring the students who come to school and do a very good job of playing school well? Do those kids just pass because they're here? Are our kids that are failing kids that just don't come to school or don't turn their assignments in? If that's the case, then we probably have a fairly large disconnect between really ensuring that a student grade is dependent on what a student knows, and that teaching and learning are directly related. And at times, unfortunately, we like to do things, again, just because we've always done them or it's easy, but it may not be what interests the kids. It may not be aligned to the standards. It may not be really connected to what the students need to learn or what the students show us that they need to learn. Thinking about grading practices, I'm certainly not going to open up that question right now, but I do think it's a very interesting, or open up that debate. I think it's an interesting conversation when we talk about the relationship between grading and feedback. Do we do so? Do we provide grades to say, we're going to be punitive in nature with this, or do we provide grades that really help push and measure where the student is to put them on the right track to be successful inside of the school? And then unequal access to external support, I think, is something that we'll hear a lot of conversations about, equity and access. How do we ensure that we have the appropriate support structures in place, not only inside the school, but outside the school? And as I mentioned earlier, the relationship that the State Board, State Department, and Herbert Henderson Office of Minority Affairs signed off on is very strong in the importance of community partnerships to make sure that we're meeting the needs. And so I think that the last two bullets here, as we think, I would encourage you to think about where you may have supports outside of your school. It's nearly impossible to be a teacher in a classroom and meet every single one of these needs on your own. And so I think it's essential that we have the partnerships outside of school as well, to make sure that we have the appropriate frameworks in place to ensure that students have, at minimum one caring adult throughout their time with us. And I think that, that we can look at strategies outside of school to help address some of those inequities and partnerships with some of those agencies that may present themselves. So again, we talked a little bit about complacency and lower expectations. And Dr. Marzano, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is going to discuss, looking at high expectancy and low expectancy students. And I think that, we need to keep that in mind, that in his research, he does point out that we certainly have had some students throughout our history in education that have had the kind of the track that they've been put on, not necessarily made by their own ability, but unfortunately sometimes by the perception of the school or the school community. And so in thinking about teachers being aware of the different expectations for different students, and think something as small as a student walks into a classroom and someone says, I had your brother last year and I've heard a lot about you, and I know you're exactly like your brother, and if we have any trouble, I'm going to send you out of the office. I don't want you in this class, and I'm going to do my best to get you out of here. Unfortunately, I think that all of us have probably seen some sort of example close to that, at least. And looking at that low expectancy versus high expectancy expectation, I think is really important and essential. And the research is very sound that students who have the high expectations set forth by their teachers and by the school community are more likely to be successful in things like behavior, in achievement, in attendance. That some of those gaps that we mentioned earlier can be addressed simply by making sure that we have high expectancy practices inside of our school. And so in thinking about that, I think it's very important for us to think about, where that may present itself. And if we, reflect on things like our team meetings, our leadership meeting, our LSICs, or collaboration period, are we reflecting on how children are discussed inside of the school? Do we talk about children with enthusiasm, with compassion, with equity, or do we complain? Do we say, I wish so-and-so was out of my class, they're not doing anything, they've been a behavior problem all year? Or do we take, the opportunity to maybe work with our colleagues and say, I'd really like to help set some goals for this student. I'm having a hard time maybe redirecting their behavior, or I don't really know what this student needs. Does someone know something that can help me with this student? Something as small as how we begin to talk about students can have a huge impact on our school culture, on the success of students, and how we move forward to make sure that we truly do have an equitable environment for our students. And I, unfortunately, when I'm sharing my screen, I can't necessarily see the chat, but I do want you to think about some ways, and feel free to write them in the chat or ask questions about ways that you can encourage positivity within your conversations with students, maybe where in your building, is in hallway conversations. Could you set, or do any of you have expectations about how you speak about students, how you talk about students, general expectations that have been adopted by your faculty and staff? And then how do we ensure that this will happen? We all know that what gets monitored gets done. Do we have in place an equity team, as we mentioned earlier? Are we talking about equity or an equity lens inside of our PLCs? So if you do have those structures in place or ideas about how to share those structures, please make sure to share those in the chat. So, in also thinking about that, we need to think about, what equity-minded teaching looks like. And I have a feeling, this is going to be a conversation that's going to come very quickly, and we're going to begin to hear, what we've heard equity throughout the school, but what does it think about to be an equity-minded teacher? And so I think, we need to make sure that we're focused on the need of the student, the particular student. You may say, well, how is it that I'm supposed to focus on the need of 35 individual students? I think that you'll see as you work collectively with your entire staff to have appropriate conversations and to share the needs and the specifics of kids, to work with, if they're involved in extracurriculars, with their coaches or sponsors, to have conversations with the parents and really have an understanding about what those children need. It will be a little bit easier than what we may think. We know certainly that we can provide for IEPs for students with disabilities on the basis of what that student needs. And I had a special education professor whenever I was going through college, who actually gave the example of making every student who wore glasses take their glasses off for the first part of the class, and wouldn't let any student wear their glasses, and waited for the first person to say, well, that's not fair. And that example, I thought, really resounded with the teacher then coming back and sharing, well, look, this is your glasses are what you need for class, so we're certainly going to allow for those processes to take hold, and you're going to be allowed to wear glasses. So where are the eyeglasses that we may have that may not be a lot of work for us, but maybe something simple that we didn't know about this child to motivate them for their particular needs? Looking at varying instructional strategies. If we are simply providing a sit and get or the same type of classroom environment or pieces of instruction every day, we're certainly not going to meet the individual needs of all of our students. And it's very possible that we may have to double back and provide different instructional strategies for different students at different times. Thinking about different assessments. I think one of the most powerful things that we can do is begin to think about how can we have formative assessments that may be open to the student's choice. How can they show us what they know? How can they prove to us that teaching and learning is certainly connected? We had you can look at a number of conversations of assessments that have shown or proven to be biased with depending on where a child is from. Are they from an urban area or a rural area? Do we understand the language that is presented in front of us? So I think that as we begin to look at assessments, are we making sure that we are providing for different opportunities for students to show us that they know, and responding to struggles and successes? Not only are we there to kind of prop them up, unfortunately, as lifeguards at times, but are we celebrating successes as we see it? Are we being human with our students to make sure that they understand that we're here to celebrate their successes as well? But at the end of the day, the most simplistic way to put equity-minded teaching is truly making sure that it's student-centered, that it's not on the basis of what is easy for us. It's not on the basis of what we would like to do or want to do, but it's on the basis of what our students need, and that we truly align teaching and learning together with appropriate assessments and interventions for students. So with that, we want to start to think about some next steps and understand that some of these conversations, if we start to talk about, putting structures and processes in place to even define what equity may look like in our schools, putting structures and processes in place to look at our data, evaluate our data sets, to determine where we currently are and where we need to go can be very, very difficult and uncomfortable, but it's okay. Because again, if we go back to equity-minded teaching and keeping it student-centered, the uncomfortableness here certainly is okay, as long as we're making sure that we are doing what's best for all students, and we're providing for what our students need. And it's okay. Not only is it okay, I think that we do have the duty and responsibility to explore where these gaps exist and ask why. And it's okay to do that as long as we are doing so with the idea that we have a growth mindset in place, that we're not just asking why to point fingers and say, well, it's your fault or this person's fault or that fault. But it's okay to ask why this gap exists, as long as we want to meet that gap with the appropriate mindset of we want change to occur, and we want change to occur for the betterment of all students. So as we begin to take a look at those data sets and the structures in place, we do want to take a look at sources and influence. Think about what sources may contribute inside of your school to disproportionate outcomes. Outside of your school, I think we know things that we're going to discuss or hear as we've been around the state that are going to impact our outcomes. Things like socioeconomic status, family structures, student culture, student background, language barriers, a family's educational history. But when we start to think about school-based, what processes or structures do we have in place maybe that are not allowing for all of our students to succeed to their potential ability? Is it instruction? Is it our assessments maybe that we're having? If we're providing the same type of assessments day in, day out, and we know that the student isn't responding to that? Do we provide the appropriate resources? Do we have programming? Do we have scheduling that offers for classes that students are interested in, or student choice? Are we limiting that student choice with class enrollment? And think about how these external sources may impact your students differently. Think about how the internal sources may impact your students differently, and how we can adapt the practices and procedures to meet students where they are. How can we address societal influences that maybe are outside of our control, but our students are still coming to us? Because we know that them, saying, well, we can't control what happens outside in the home life. We've known that now for some time, and it's been highlighted with the opioid epidemic, with the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen all kinds of concerns that we know are outside of our control, but we still know that we have that responsibility of making sure that we're meeting the needs of all students. So I think it's important for us to think about how each of those may impact our students, but then how we're going to respond. And so in thinking about that response, I think it's essential as a next step to make sure that we have the appropriate root cause analysis in place. And this is just an example from Hanover that looks about any of the cycle of continuous improvement data or cycle of continuous improvement practices that you're going to see are going to be very similar in nature. That we need to first look at, examine our data, and we're going to raise them the appropriate questions. So not just why the data are there, why the data are the way that they are, but what data sets are related to each other. For instance, do we ask our question, I think a real interesting data relationship that can be related to equity is, are we looking at graduation rate of students tied in with attendance rate, or tied in with our number of student failures? So do we have a large number of student failures? Those students fail going to graduate. Do we have a large number of student failures but at a high attendance rate, but a high graduation rate? How are we getting that caught up? Does that mean that we have an appropriate graduation rate that truly measures the students that should have graduated? Do we have a relationship that's maybe inversely related between student failures and attendance? Maybe we have a low number of student failures, but a high number of chronically absent students. So how does that data potentially impact each other or relate to each other? So as we move on, then after we raise the questions, we look for solutions. And as Hanover mentions here, this is a really tough spot in thinking about what is maybe an appropriate solution that is going to provide an equitable environment. And it's tough because as we begin to think about this, we need to be able to understand that some of these influences on the data that we have, maybe things that we really don't want to admit are there. Maybe it's our classroom climate or environment that isn't as welcoming to a student, so they don't want to come. And maybe we don't have the data there, and we don't necessarily want to go looking for it at times. So this can be very, very difficult. But then look at this, select the solutions that we want to use and implement. Think of, a what if statement that we can do here as well. If my problem is I'm hungry, and I can say, what if I eat? Well, then I should not be hungry anymore. So we can go very basic to very complex on these solutions. And then, very important is the evaluation of these progresses. So if we set the timeline and the parameters of who's going to monitor it, when it's going to be monitored, how we're going to report out, we should start to see whether or not these processes are being successful or not. So as we think about what's next moving forward, I think it's important for us to make sure that we are taking the opportunity to apply an equity lens. An equity lens should be something that promotes structure to ensure that we have the appropriate safeguards in place to have conversations when appropriate. I'll share an example of that here in just a second. That we need to look at our school culture and make sure that it's accepting and appreciative of diversity, and not just diversity as far as race and ethnicity. As we move around the state, we know we have a lot of districts that say, well, I don't have a very diverse climate or culture inside of my school. I would argue that every single one of our schools has a very, very diverse culture, that every one of our families comes from a different background, comes from a different expectation as far as family structure. It comes from different religious backgrounds, different cultural understanding and backgrounds. So we are rich with cultural diversity around the state, and we need to be appreciative and understand that those differences in our diverse communities are going to greatly impact the school that we have. And the more willing we are to accept that and understand, the more readily available we're going to be able to meet the individual needs of students. I think we need to become comfortable in asking difficult questions and searching for answers. In addition to that, we need to be able to look at if we adopt these practices and expectations, that we do hold each other accountable, that we're willing to say, this is not how we do things around here. If we have someone that steps out of line with the mission or the vision of the schools, that we begin to look at strengths rather than deficits. It's very easy to start to look and say, we've got all these problems to overcome. We can't. But if we begin to look at the strengths of where we can and how we have been successful and where we can succeed, I think we will see some very meaningful change moving forward. That we do create the appropriate structures, that we measure and evaluate our successes. It's not going to help us just to put something out and expect that it's just going to happen by osmosis. But if we are willing to have the difficult conversation, if we're willing to truly know our students and put the appropriate structures in place, I truly believe that we can have an environment that is conducive for the needs of all students. And last but not least, this is just an example of an equity lens that was adopted to potentially look at the needs. As you can see, an appropriate lens should ask questions if we have a policy that's up for discussion, if we have decisions that are going to impact student groups inside of the school. Asking ourselves a series of questions that can kind of scaffold themselves can be very beneficial in our mindset moving forward to make sure that we have the appropriate processes and structures in place. So again, just to kind of wrap things up, I hope that we see that kind of big picture from here. We do need to have an understanding really of what equity is. We need to know where our appropriate data sets are to be able to evaluate the where we are and what we're going to do with it. We need to take a look at really the structures that we have in place from a school level, from a district level, from a classroom level, make sure that we're putting those structures in place to truly understand our students, to provide for the most meaningful experience that they can possibly have. And with that, again, my name is Drew McClanahan. My contact information is right here. I know that is a few minutes early, but I want to give an opportunity to answer any questions that we may have. So I want to figure out how to stop sharing my screen now.
You have quite a number of happy birthday wishes in the chat.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And I'm struggling with figuring out how to stop sharing on this. I'm sorry.
Do you have a button down at the bottom that kind of looks like a computer screen?
There we go. Thank you. It's all right. So if we have any questions, let me get back to the chat. And thank you for the happy birthday. Thank you for the happy birthday wishes. I really, really appreciate that. So, Chaz, I thank you. Questions that we may have. Pamela, I'm seeing that, and I think that is exciting, and it's unfortunate, but also exciting that we have these processes and need to have these processes and structures with closets open to all students. I think that as we begin to see that those community partnerships, those are the perfect opportunities to reach out and really show that our schools are our community centers as well, that can really be there to support the needs of all students. Yeah, and we have seen unfortunately it is shocking and sad to see the disproportionate rate of suspension and discipline for students, and we do use that as an example because we've seen attendance rates that have been presented for the last few years. We've seen achievement rates for a number of years, and I think it's really interesting. The good news is we have seen a general trend downward with suspension and discipline rates around the state. And so it is my hope that certainly we understand the influence, and even coming out of COVID, if we can learn anything, it's if we don't have children in front of us, that it can be even more difficult to try to get them on pace for grade level. So that certainly is a part of our work moving forward, is working with districts to make sure that we can make sure that structures are put in place and the policy is appropriate for student discipline, to not be punitive, but to really be restorative and try to address what a student may need to be successful. So any other questions, comments, concerns?
Drew, you've mentioned a number of resources for us to check out, but are there any professional development opportunities if individuals were wanting a little more professional development around equity in education that you're aware of?
Yes, ma'am. So, I mean, right now there are a ton of people that are diving into this work. I would urge caution just to make sure that if you can, look online or see a number of different resources, that whomever you would maybe choose to go with aligns directly to what your strategic plan or mission or vision of your school is. From the Department of Ed, though, my office is certainly happy to come out and provide kind of a customized support. We don't want to just do a one-on-one. We do want to look at districts and schools with their data, with their schools, with whatever their needs are. And so feel free to reach out to me, if you have those concerns or questions for additional professional learning at your school. We do have data practices for school leaders that we look at. We have some additional processes to look at, Zoom e-training that can allow us to dive into those resources. We're happy to do a root cause analysis. Michelle Moore Leftwich from our Office of Federal Programs does an amazing job with the root cause analysis and strategic plan training that ties in directly with our work in equity. The work that we do with school culture, we have a whole school culture piece, ties directly in with our work in equity. And the Hanover Research has done a lot and presents information email each week. Now, that there is a cost associated with Hanover that I know that we as a department have bought into, just because we partner with them on a number of initiatives. But if your organization has some resources, there's plenty of money going around right now with CARES funding. You may want to take a look at Hanover Research, because they're providing research briefs and equity toolkits, outlines on a regular basis. And so there's a lot of research out there. I would just encourage you to do your homework and make sure that it is something that aligns with the mission or vision of your school.
Wonderful, thank you. Does anybody else have any final questions for Drew?
All right, well, I greatly appreciate. No, go ahead, I'm sorry, Autumn.
That's okay. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing your time and expertise. And I'd like to thank all of our attendees for being here for the session. And I just want to invite everybody to head to the closing plenary session, which will be starting at 3:15. We have a really dynamic speaker lined up for you, so don't miss out on that. And if you've not already done so, don't forget to share insights from this year's conference on social media using our hashtag StudentSuccessWV. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.